IBESS, Water and Aquatic Food Production Part 11, is the second of 3 movies on water pollution. This movie, Part 11, looks at 3 things: the instruments used to measure pollution, as well as the biotic indicators of pollution, and lastly, this movie introduces management strategies that serve to mitigate pollution. The significant ideas are water pollution, both to groundwater and surface water, is a major global problem, the effects of which influence human and other biological systems. The second significant idea is pollution management strategies can be applied at different levels. Here is the first of 2 slides that outline the available movies in the Water Aquatic Food Production Unit. Use this outline to find the movie you need to review. This movie is outlined on the next slide. Here is the second of 2 slides that outline the available movies in the Water Aquatic Food Production Unit. Use this outline to find the movie you need for review. This movie is focused here. Here is the first IB syllabus statement of the movie. A wide range of parameters can be used to directly test the quality of aquatic systems, including pH, temperature, suspended solids, otherwise known as turbidity, metals, nitrates, and phosphates. In this image, you can see a nitrate sensor and a heavy metal sensor. Both nitrates and heavy metals are inorganic pollutants. The temperature sensor can be used to assess thermal pollution. The pH sensor could detect industrial discharge into a river, fresh water pollution. Turbidity is a measure of the cloudiness of a fluid caused by large numbers of suspended particles, each of which is generally invisible to the naked eye. Sensors and Secchi discs measure levels of turbidity. In this image, you can see clean water and turbid water. I've defined turbidity here in case you want to take a note. Turbid water has numerous suspended solids and generally is not transparent to light. Here is a list of various sensors that can be used in the field to measure pollution. So that brings us to these IB syllabus statements. Some species can be indicative of polluted waters and can be used as indicator species. A biotic index indirectly measures pollution by assaying the impact on species within the community according to their tolerance, diversity, and relative abundance. Lastly, explain the use of an indicator species and biotic indices in measuring aquatic pollution. The presence or absence of certain aquatic species can be an indirect indicator of water cleanliness. Let's take a look. Walking into a stream with a net and certain knowledge of data collection allows one to collect aquatic species for examination in an indirect biotic index. The kick sampling method for assaying species living in a river or a stream involves placing the net downstream of one's feet and with standardized motion disrupting the stream bottom. Invertebrates, insects, and worms living on the stream bottom can be collected as the current carries the invertebrates into the net. The species seen in these photos are indicative of clean water. These species have low tolerance for polluted water. Indicator species are an indirect measure of water cleanliness. The species seen in these photos are indicative of polluted waters. These species have high tolerance for polluted water. Indicator species are an indirect measure of water pollution. The presence or absence of certain species can be quantified or placed on a scale to determine a biotic index. A biotic index indirectly measures pollution by assaying the impact on species within the community according to their tolerance, diversity, and relative abundance. Pay close attention through the next few slides. The presence or absence of certain species can be quantified or placed on a scale to determine a biotic index. Species can be given a tolerance rating that can be used to indirectly assess pollution levels. One can sum the number of individuals of each species, then multiply by a pollution tolerance rating, then divide by the total number of individuals in the sample to provide an index, a biotic index. The index can be used to assess water cleanliness. Low values indirectly indicate clean water. High values indicate polluted water. This table displays data from various locations. The data includes the total number of fish caught. It includes the number of different species in each location. This is species richness. It includes the percent of fish tolerant of low oxygen conditions. Low oxygen is typical of polluted waters. And the percent of fish tolerant of disturbed conditions. A biotic index score is mathematically calculated, and according to the biotic index, the water is given a rating. Some species can be indicative of polluted waters, and this can be used as an indicator species. A biotic index indirectly measures pollution by assaying the impact of the pollution on species within the community according to their tolerance of the pollution, diversity, and relative abundance. Can you explain the use of indicator species and biotic indices in measuring aquatic pollution? Here is a nice image displaying pollution released as industrial discharge from a specific point in a river. The current carries the pollution downstream. From the point of pollution, you can see an increase in the pollution-tolerant species. From the point of pollution, you can see the oxygen levels decline. But the further away from the discharge, downriver, the river becomes cleaner, the pollution-tolerant species disappear as the clean water species reappear and oxygen levels rise. Now be aware that for some pollutants there may be a time lag before a significant effect on organisms is evident. You can see how the change in the river species requires a bit of time during which the community is exposed to the pollution. Here is a similar image to the last slide. Pollution is discharged into a river here, and current carries the pollution downstream. From the point of pollution, we can see oxygen levels decline as biological oxygen demand rises. Downstream, well away from the point of discharge, we can see oxygen levels rise and biological oxygen demand declines. We will learn more about biological oxygen demand, BOD, in the next movie. From the point of discharge, we can see the change in the community as the pollution-tolerant species increase and the clear water species decrease after a slight time lag. Further downstream, away from the discharge, the river becomes clean again. Here is a graph from the Milwaukee, Wisconsin Metropolitan Sewerage District. It's a graph that shows a fish biotic index score plotted against percent urban land use for 15 stream sites in this Milwaukee, Wisconsin district. You can clearly see the relationship. The greater the urban land use, the lower the biotic index. As a side note, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, published in 2005, you can read along with me, gave a scientific appraisal of the condition and trends in the world's ecosystems and the services that those ecosystems provide using environmental indicators. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment is a major assessment of the human impact on the environment. It popularized the term ecosystem services, meaning the benefits gained by humans from ecosystems that are left intact, undisturbed. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment assessed the impact of societies both indirect, and direct on ecosystems. Now you can study this slide on your own to better understand the interrelationship between the drivers of change, ecosystem services, and human well-being that feeds back to accelerate or dampen change. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment identified biodiversity, pollution, population, or climate as quantitative indicators of environmental sustainability. These factors can be applied on a range of scales from local to global. I'll let you read this slide on your own. So that brings us to the last IB syllabus statement of the movie. Describe and evaluate aquatic pollution management strategies with respect to runoff, sewage, solid domestic waste, and industrial discharge. The framework for managing pollution can be applied to any source of pollution. I'm introducing the framework here in the context of water pollution. Now, societies produce the pollutant, they release the pollutant, and then the pollutant has an impact on the environment. The question is, which strategy is the best one for mitigating the impact of the pollutant? Now we have strategy 1. We can reduce the production of the pollutant mostly by altering human activity. We can develop alternative technologies or adopt alternative lifestyles and values. And we can do this through campaigns, education, government legislation, or economic incentives or disincentives. Or societies can control the release of the pollutant by legislation, law, or developing technologies for extracting the pollutant from waste emissions. Now, this strategy is less good than the first one because the pollutant is already in production and there is some pollutant released into the environment. And lastly, the third strategy is that societies can clean up and restore damaged ecosystems by extracting and removing the pollutant from the ecosystem or replanting, restocking lost or depleted populations of plant and animal species. Now, this third strategy is the least effective of the three, 1, 2, 3, because damage has already been done. But just because it's the least desirable of the strategies doesn't mean that it should be ignored. This is an important step once pollution has had an impact. Strategy 1 is altering human activities through education, incentives, and penalties to promote the development of alternative technologies or to promote the adoption of alternative lifestyles. Now, in terms of reducing water pollution, societies could use less chemical fertilizer or substitute manure for the inorganic chemical fertilizer. Now we can evaluate this. Agricultural productivity might decrease if we use less chemical fertilizer or if we use manure instead of chemical fertilizer, but the farmer might save money if using less fertilizer or save money if using manure instead of the chemical fertilizer. Now, strategy 2 involves controlling the release of the pollutant at the point of emission by introducing measures through legislation or technology for extracting the pollutant from the waste stream. Now, we could reduce water pollution by planting buffer zones, planting trees, these buffer zones between the field where the chemical fertilizers are and the river. This would remove, these trees, the buffer zone would remove the excess fertilizers before they reach the river. Now, can we evaluate this? Sure. If we're growing a buffer zone, we're not producing any crop. Here's another example of strategy 2. In these images, we have a water treatment facility where chemicals and aeration are used to increase the bacterial decomposition, which reduces the water pollution before the water is released out to the environment. Now, we can evaluate this. It's expensive, requires government oversight, and in some cases, the environment has already suffered degradation. Wastewater treatment plants, as you can see in this image, extracts the pollutants from the water before the water reaches the river. Wastewater treatment removes organic matter or nitrates or phosphates. Now this is strategy 2, but wastewater treatment is expensive and requires cooperation among various groups in the community. Strategy 3 is the cleanup and restoration of damaged systems by extracting and removing the pollutant from the ecosystem and replanting or restocking with plant and animal populations. So for example, in the left image you can see this is the removal of excess growth of an invasive species, and this pond would then be restocked with fish. In the right image we see the dredging of accumulated sediment in a pond following pollution. Now we can evaluate it. This strategy is expensive and it is temporary as it requires yearly work. Also, the environment has already suffered degradation. Here is an image of strategy 3 with respect to water pollution, extracting and removing the pollutant from the ecosystem. In this case, the pollutant is an invasive species. Now this is expensive and it's temporary as it does not address the root problem. Here are people implementing strategy 3 by replanting an area that has suffered damage, water pollution damage. The replanting is expensive in terms of time, people, and money, and unless the pollutant has been removed, the effort might be fruitless. The effort may require more than one attempt before being successful. Once again, with a focus on water pollution, let's review the strategies. Strategy 1 involves altering human activity through education, incentives, and penalties to promote alternative lifestyle choices or alternative technologies. So for example, biodegradable soaps, as you can see in this image, would be an alternative to regular soaps that serves to reduce water pollution. But we can evaluate that. The alternative soap may not be as effective, thus more soap might be required to clean whatever it is that's being cleaned. Alternative technologies, such as reusing cloth bags or using less plastic, would result in less industrial pollution getting into our waterways. We could alter human activity through education, incentives, and penalties. Banning the use of plastic beads in skin gels would reduce the level of solid domestic waste entering our rivers and oceans. Boycotting these products is a strategy 1 approach, but remember that altering human behavior can be difficult. We may need incentives and penalties. Through legislation, we could control the release of the pollutant at the point of emission. This is strategy 2. Legislation requires governmental action, and it tends to take time. Reducing the use of aluminum or plastic is a strategy 1 approach to reducing domestic waste in our waterways. Now, recycling is both a strategy 1 and 2 approach. When we choose to recycle, we are altering our behavior, and that's strategy 1, but we're also reducing the release of the waste into the environment by moving the waste into a recycling project. That would be strategy 2. Again, strategy 3 is cleanup and restoration of damaged systems. In this photo, we can see people cleaning a beach of oil following an oil spill at sea. This is expensive, and the environment has already suffered from pollution. Strategy 3, while environmentally beneficial, is less effective than strategy 2 or 1 in terms of mitigating the impact of the pollution on the environment. These are images of cleanup projects along beaches. Now, these efforts serve to reduce floating debris in aquatic ecosystems. These activities are examples of strategy 3. They take time, they can be expensive, and the environment has already suffered degradation. And that brings us to the end of IB ESS, Water and Aquatic Food Production, Part 11.